Peace. I'm glad you could tune in. This is Self-Centered Wellness. My name is Alicia Jefferson, and I'll be with you for the next 15-20 minutes or so. I'd like to explore with you the theme Alpo, Martinez, and PTSD among black men who survived the crack era. Alpo, Martinez, and PTSD among black men who survived the crack era. So let's get into it. I recall riding in a car with some family and friends, all guys, a number of years back. And we were riding along, going to where we were going, and a car that, on the other side of the road had backfired, as they say. So a loud noise, let off, boom, sounded similar to a gunshot. And everyone but the driver, though the driver was jolted, everyone was like, yo! And then they laughed it off once we realized it was a car that, it backfired. And we continued driving, and they laughed and kind of cracked jokes on each other about who went the lowest and that sort of thing. But when I think about that today, and I think about recent events surrounding this Alpo Martinez, the former drug dealer in New York who was murdered only days ago, I think about post-traumatic stress disorder and how many black men in the community, and not only black men, but I want to talk about them this episode, many black men in the black community who grew up in what's considered the crack era in black and brown communities. The time, late 70s, the 80s, all of the 80s, and into the 90s, when crack cocaine flooded black and brown communities in America. And so many young people, so many black males took to the streets, selling drugs, eventually using drugs, selling drugs, but got entwined in all of that mayhem that followed the flood of crack cocaine onto the streets of America, particularly black and brown communities. And I think about the trauma that they experienced, whether behind the gun or in front of the gun. On both sides, PTSD, undiagnosed from then until now, and we're 20, 30 years removed from the time of the crack era, the crack epidemic, when Reagan and Bush administrations were in charge of the country. You have young men who grew into men, had children of their own, and riding in the car with these guys, that was one incident. And all of them responded in a way that a soldier would, who was suffering with or living with PTSD. Oh, yep. They thought somebody was firing on the car. They thought their lives were in jeopardy, in danger. And this is a symptom of PTSD. We see many black males unable to hold jobs, unable to maintain employment, which also is a symptom of PTSD. Many of them, have a lot of irritation, are easily irritated, agitated from minor incidents, which is also a symptom of PTSD. Many of them have, and I'm speaking in general terms about the black males who were on the streets, hustling, involved in hardcore street hustling, selling drugs, using drugs, gang banging, and we see many of them have difficulty maintaining relationships, romantic relationships. There's a lot of domestic abuse, domestic violence. Even if it's not reported, it's happening with family members, friends, acquaintances. It's a known thing within the black and brown communities where some of our men have not recovered from their life on the streets during what has come to be known as the crack era. And we know they haven't sought out or are not seeking out mental health services because there's a stigma even now with a lot of celebrities and such promoting mental health. They have not sought out or not seeking out, for the most part, mental health services, counseling, therapy. And I couldn't help but think about, after seeing some of the footage around Alpo Martinez and the trauma that he was involved in, you know, behind the gun, in front of the gun, and those who knew him and were around within his circle back during the crack era when he was at his height, so to speak, him and his associates. I couldn't help but think about PTSD running rampant within his circle of friends or crime partners, even up to this day, those who are still alive, because many were murdered. Those who are still alive, I couldn't help but think about the trauma, the post-traumatic stress that they are suffering with. And then it led me to think about other communities of men who came up in very similar ways as Alpo and his crew. Came up in very similar ways. Carrying guns, kidnapping people, killing people, being shot at, running from someone trying to shoot them, running from police. All of that, being in houses that were doors were kicked in and they were laid down by robbers or police. Being in cars that were shot at and shot up. Seeing their friends, riddled with bullets beside them in cars or in houses or at parties or in the streets. They were in war. They lived through a war. And I can't help but think about the many black men who survived the crack era. I'm not even really getting into the gangbangers of the 2000s who we know are suffering with PTSD. I'm thinking about those that I came up with late 70s, in the 80s, on to the 90s. I'm thinking about those men who were the age of Alpo Martinez and his crew coming up during that time. I can't help but think about the PTSD that they're living with, suffering with silently. The nightmares that keep them awake. The sleepless nights. The continuous marijuana smoking. pill taking, alcohol drinking, self-medicating to deal with the thoughts and the images and reliving of the events, suffering with that silently. On top of the street code of not talking, right? There's the stigma around mental health. So these men live with this silently. And some rage out on their girlfriends, on their wives. Some still move through the community feeling paranoid and in danger and ready to do someone harm before harm is done to them, whether real or imaginary. It's just as if they went off overseas to war, but only they were here in the States and are still living in those communities, many of them. Some move out, live out on the outskirts, and when they come back into town, they do it discreetly sometimes. And many of them are isolating themselves. They're not moving around with their crew that they once associated with. They may hang out with one or two. For the most part, they're with their girls, their girlfriends, their women, and living somewhat in an isolated fashion. They may get together from time to time, but many of them are moving solo, they say. I move solo, I move dolo. I know what I'm going to say and what I'm not going to say. So, in a sense, it's as if, they're shielding themselves behind the street code of silence and moving alone and not being able to trust people. But these are symptoms that the soldiers who come back from overseas, who were in battle on the field, this is how they operate. In isolation, few friends from time to time. I can't help but think about them and want to encourage you, if you are one who walked that walk and are now a survivor, but suffering with possibly PTSD. I encourage you, get help to process your emotions. Get help to process, the images that you may see, those events that you may be reliving. Or if you know someone who came through that violent time and may very well be living with PTSD because of the traumatic events they witnessed, the traumatic events they took part in. If you know someone, a loved one, a friend, I encourage you, when you're able to, share a bit of information possibly about PTSD and some of its symptoms, or when you're able to possibly point them in the direction of getting help to process some of the emotions they may be suppressing or trying to cope with, or some of the images that they can't get out of their head, some of the deaths, some of the murders they've seen, witnessed, possibly committed, and they're grappling with those images and can't get past, can't get over the hump of the feelings, the emotions, the images, the burden of those days, because they never was able to process those emotions and those events during that time. laugh it off with their homeboys, their buddies, act as if it didn't bother them, try to show no remorse. Everyone in a crew, in a gang, or part of a team of hustlers, or even if they moved about by themselves, everyone is not a psychopath. Everyone is not psychopathic. Many of them can still feel, and are suffering. And when I seen some of the images, heard some of the interviews and bits of like documentaries, maybe not documentaries, but bits of interviews with this Alpo Martinez and others who knew him and others who knew of some of the events, or even when I recall the movie Paid in Full, which depicts his life and some of his friends or crew members at that time, their lives during the crack era. We see suffering, and though that was a movie, this is real life. Many young men live through situations like that movie depicts, and the recent footage that's come out around those events and interviews and discussions. Many men in different parts of this country, brown and black men, lived out those events as well, and are walking, dealing with that silently, trying to manage their lives. Many of them are mismanaging their lives. Some of them appear to be okay, and some are okay. Some may have quietly gotten help, whether spiritual help. Many have turned to the church or to the mosque and have sought out help possibly that way. But many are walking through our communities, alcoholics, addicted to pills of some sort, smoking reefer, marijuana on a daily basis. And we know substance abuse and self-medicating is part of associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. I encourage you, my heart goes out to you. There is help. There are people you can turn to, counselors, spiritual practitioners. There are methods you could use to get inner peace, whether it's meditation, Tai Chi. There are methods you could use to gain inner peace, emotional wellness, and get on the path of forgiving yourself, forgiving others. We were all young. You were young. And even if you grew older in that life, it was larger than you. We didn't know it at the time. It was greater than the Alpos and the Riches and the different ones that have become known. But the ones in your community, you, your family member, it was greater than you, greater than our communities. We didn't know. And we have men suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder and other things, but I want to talk about that. I'm just speaking about that because that's what came to my mind when I heard the stories of Alpo Martinez and the violent deaths that he was a part of. And the violent death that he suffered himself not too long ago. All of it led me to think about our brown and black men who survived the crack era but are still living with nightmares, emotional imbalance, mental imbalance because of those traumatic times. There is a path where you can begin to heal. Seek help. You don't have to do it silently. You don't have to go it alone. You don't have to self-medicate. I offer you, I urge you, I encourage you, I implore you, make some choices that'll help you begin to heal. Forgive yourself. Forgive yourself. And step onto a path of healing for yourself and your loved ones. You probably have children. For yourself and for your loved ones. Take a few seconds with me. I'd like to just take some breaths. 3 deep breaths. Just considering Alpo Martinez and PTSD among black men who have survived the crack era. If it's you, I encourage you, don't go it alone. If it's a loved one of yours, a friend of yours, an acquaintance, if you're able to at some point to point them in a direction where they could begin to get healing, a gentle nudge if you're able to, when you're able to. I like to end as I began. Peace. I'm glad you tuned in. My name is Alicia. This is Self-Centered Wellness. Until next time.